Bonaparte and Matt Wilson. We are also supported by AAAS Fellows Cristina Moranto and Mattia Muniz in the NSBO office. So we have a relatively short meeting today, so let's jump right in. First of all, let's start with the February 2018 meeting minutes. Are there any comments or corrections to these minutes?
Okay.
Hearing no corrections, the February minutes stand approved as presented. So on to our next topic, an update on the project to reimagine science and engineering indicators. As we've discussed over the past few months, as indicators have grown, production of the volume has become difficult to sustain for NSF's NCSES. The switch to digital report for 2016 created a great opportunity for NSB and NCSES to not only address production inefficiencies, but also make indicators more useful and timely for our users without sacrificing quality. The trifecta, high quality, more useful, and more sustainable, is easy to say this early in the morning, but also difficult to accomplish. We are fortunate to have a dedicated team of experts within NSF who are absolutely up to the task. We will now take a brief update on this project. Let me remind the board that we only have 10 minutes total for this item. Just trying to keep us on time. Our thought was that we would get a short update and then we would raise key issues or risks that collectively we ought to consider in going forward. We would then hold a teleconference in the near future to discuss this in a lot more detail. With that, let me turn to Dr. Faye Cook, the AD for NSF Social and Behavioral and Economic Sciences, and then she will turn it over to Badika in their 5 minutes of comments.
Hey, well, as Jerry has already said very well, at January's SEP Retreat, which was great, we really developed a shared vision to accomplish two important goals. One, to make the indicators more useful and more timely for all of our many stakeholders for indicators. And two, and really also important, to increase the production efficiencies for the NCSES staff. And it's this vision that's guiding this still initial work that we're going to be talking more about for the reimagined indicators. And Bathika, as you know, is serving as SEP Executive Secretary, and she's the Program Director within NCSES and SBE for the Indicators Project. Bathika.
Thank you. Thank you, Faye. Thank you, Faye. Good morning. One of the things we discussed in January was the important One of the things we discussed in January during our retreat was the important attributes of the current indicators report that we ought to keep in some way as we move forward. First and foremost are the congressional mandate and the quality. Our focus will continue to be the state of science and engineering in the US, and we must maintain the credibility of data and analysis, including its policy relevance and objective, neutral, and timely nature. To make the information accessible to a wide and diverse audience, and our readership has really grown over the years to include both experts and non-experts, we want to provide the information in a tiered way, from high-level summaries all the way down to detailed data tables. Related to this, we want to keep something like the digest, which conveys key findings with rich graphics and short narrative text. Additionally, as Faye mentioned, an important consideration is that we want to smooth out and reduce production burden, number one, for NCSES, so that indicators production doesn't impede the timely release of other NCSES data products and publications, and number two, for the board and SEP members, so that the board has the time to fulfill its statutory responsibility as policy advisors. So our shared vision for moving forward was to disaggregate the current indicators process and products into 4 components, represented by the 4 boxes on this slide. Box 1 reflects a concise summary report combining the best elements of the current digest and the overview chapter, delivered on January 15th of even-numbered years as required by law. This report would come closest to answering the question, what is the state of science and engineering in the US? Box 2 is where we envision the biggest changes to the current indicators report, and I'll give you more detail in a moment. Box 3 reflects special or one-off reports that we envision producing after we get the new setup running, that is after 2020, which is why it has a lighter shade as its background. These one-off reports would be policy relevant but neutral and could cover emerging issues, cross-cutting themes, or go in-depth on certain topics. Box 4 reflects the board's current policy companion reports produced on an as-needed basis. Overall, our hope is that a sequential model for disseminating data and analysis would enable both the board and SBE NCSES to be more efficient and agile in light of changing information needs and an evolving and complex SNE landscape. So our initial work in the past few months has focused on the two left boxes, the Box 1 and Box 2 reports. For Box 1, we envision a report which will be available both in digital and print media. Like the current digest and the overview chapter, it'll be short and concise, highlight a small selection of indicators from the thematic reports, and include compellingly presented data. We are currently working with publication designers to prepare some alternative layouts for this report. Again, we want to combine the best elements of the digest and the overview chapter. And we are working on these layouts with the goal of a high-quality, high-impact publication. Once the prototypes are available, NCSES will assess their feasibility, make necessary modifications, and distribute for board review and input. We envision, as I said, the biggest change to the current indicators report in Box 2. Box 2 reflects the stock of data, analysis, and knowledge that NCSES develops over time and that it would draw from to create the Box 1 report. Here we envision several reports that are organized thematically, like the current indicators chapters, such as education, workforce, R&D, innovation, high-tech industries, public attitudes and understanding, and the like. Produced by NCSES with board input, these reports would be born digital, policy relevant, objective, and policy neutral. In contrast to the current indicators chapters, which are published in entirety on January 15th, however, we envision these components to be released as a series of short reports in order to make the information more timely, targeted, less dense, and level the production burden. What we have heard time and again from our various stakeholders is indicators is widely utilized. It's considered the gold standard. However, our current chapter format, technical, dense and encyclopedic, and the biennial frequency are not the most impactful or effective. So much of our initial work in the past few months has focused on generating ideas for topic organization for these thematic reports. We started with our current chapter content and thought about how to streamline and disaggregate them with a few critical questions in mind. How can we align production with data availability to make the information more timely? What are the core primary indicators? Are the data available somewhere else? And if so, how can we better leverage other products coming out of NCSES as well as other federal statistical agencies? What do we know about the potential users of certain indicators? Does the audience reflect a small niche, or is it a broader group? How frequently do we see changes, or how repetitive is the trend year to year? Do we need to cover all indicators every cycle? And related to this, which topics could be covered in a Box 3 or one-off report? Historically, we have had a robust mechanism for adding new content, but not an efficient mechanism for swapping or removing content. So what could be covered in regular thematic reports as well as opposed to special one-off reports? And overall, a very critical question in our mind has been, how can we guard against this new model requiring more resources? With this framework in mind, we are in the process of preparing a proposed list of thematic reports. A key feature of this vision is that it is scalable. 2020 cycle is the beginning rather than the end of this re-engineering process, and the scope and number of thematic reports can be scaled up and down, and it will be an iterative process, and we can learn from the process as we move on. During summer or early fall of this year, we plan to share with the board a tentative list and schedule of these thematic reports for board input. This concludes my update, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Bathika. Do we have any comments or questions from the board? Bent.
Just to say that I really like the direction that you're heading in. It will make this report a lot more readily absorbable by people who don't have time to read the entire text of the report. And I certainly like the digital theme, since that'll make the data more fungible, more useful for people to analyze. So I'm a big supporter for this direction.
Ellen?
Yeah, I would concur on that. So my question is in box 2, as you do these different reports, part of it is, as of what date are you compiling the data and then drawing the graphs? And if you put out different reports, are they based on different dates, of when the data was compiled, which, might make it a little bit hard to compare one of the reports with another? So I was just wondering what your thinking was on that.
So for this transition year for 2020, what we have in mind is structuring the thematic reports under the broad topics that we currently cover. So we'll have maybe 1 or 2 reports on workforce, 1 on higher education, 1 on public attitudes. And so for workforce, for example, I'll use that as an example. We have some primary data sources. So we are basically going to align production to the, top 2, the most important primary data sources, and develop them and disseminate them. So workforce will most likely be one of the earlier reports that we disseminate, because those data we expect to be available by the end of the year. So assuming that, the dissemination side of NCSCS, that, we can put a process in place in time, we expect the workforce report to be published, toward the beginning of the cycle, sometime next year. Under the original model, we would have waited a full year to disseminate everything on January 15th of 2020. The R&D data, for example, which will be available toward the end of 2019. So we are looking at disseminating that information closer to 2020, January 15th, 2020. So in that sense, it's a flow basis, hopefully aligned with data availability.
Okay, I'll take just 2 more. Panj and Bob.
Again, a great outline. Thank you so much. I just was going to ask on the digital side, I think we might want to think of more imaginative ways of how do you communicate digital information. In this day of short attention spans, how might we think about short bursts of information, like a factoid of the week or something that is being sent? Because consuming reports, as people become less and less likely to read the entire report, you might think of 56 factoids, whatever it is in a year that you can send to people. That can be very valuable, I think. To really get maximum, you do amazing work, amazing amount of data that is there. I want people to get value out of it more than where we are right now. So we might want to think about other digital mechanisms that can get people excited.
Great.
Thank you.
Same lines? Oh, then we have a minute for Artie. Artie, did you want to say something? Or half a minute?
Are we going to upgrade what are now the appendix tables as the data come in?
So the plan is, at least for the 2020 cycle, we are expecting that the number of appendix tables will go down. Assuming we can leverage existing data tables. For 2020, we are not looking at a continuous update. For 2020, we are looking at literally disaggregating what we have currently, streamlining what we have, and publishing the data by those topics. Moving forward, that's something we'd be very interested in exploring, how we can incorporate real-time updates, again, going forward, after we have the current setup in place.
Well, thank you, Bathika and Faye. Bathika, you and your team have put in a lot of work since we last met, so it's very, very much appreciated. This update certainly is. Okay, well, let me move on to the next topic then, and that is discussion of the second companion statement to Indicators 2018. So as a reminder, at the February meeting, we decided to focus on the second policy companion on the state of the U.S. science enterprise in global context. There are several reasons to focus on this topic right now, if you recall from our conversation. There's strong interest from the Hill administration and the media. It will complement the statement of the board that was released predicting that China will surpass the U.S. on total R&D expenditures later this year, and there are several indicators in the 2018 report to support an impactful policy statement. Since February, NSB's office staff have held one-on-one conversations with a few of the SCP members. The purpose of the calls has been to engage a couple of you in very early in the process, as we have done in the past, to ensure that the statement encapsulates the approach, breadth, and key messages important to the board members. The outcome of these one-on-one conversations is the policy companion outline that you will see in Diligent. This is a first draft of the outline, and we'd like to solicit the input of both SCP and the entire NSB so that we can improve and begin putting the pieces together. Now, before leaping into the discussion, I would like to provide a bit of context about the outline. The outline is very generic while still trying to focus on this particular topic. As we go through the sections of the outline, I would like to have you keep three things in mind. One is, who is our audience? What would you like our impact to be with this companion, particularly to that audience and others? And what value can the board bring to the overall discussion? These strategic questions will help inform our scope and format as we focus on this singular companion piece, but also think about ones from the future. For scope, we may choose to do a more extensive treatment of the issue discussed within the outline, or we could maintain an overview approach, both of which potentially could be useful to Congress and the administration and others. This will have ramifications. This will have an effect on the length of the piece and the amount of time it would take to produce it. So, thank you, Matt. In terms of format, we would produce this companion as a single report, or it could be broken up into a sequence of smaller reports and briefs that we could produce and release over time as the next year goes forward. So now on to the outline, and it's in Diligent. I'll just walk you through this very quickly if you haven't pulled it up. Section 1 is really framing the paper and addressing several key inputs to and implications of the country's leadership in this scientific leadership in various areas. Section 2 then addresses the how the U.S. stands in the global context using several robust indicators similar to what we've seen in the rollout, including R&D, STEM education, scientific impact to high-tech industries. The conclusion of this section will be consistent with the board indicator 2018 messages that the U.S. is losing ground in scientific leadership as other countries are building capacity. The U.S. is no longer the only leader, and we are being challenged according to several key indicators. Section 3 focuses on the all-important "so what?" question. It offers 2 points that policymakers should consider in light of the growing global competition. 1, the importance of quality versus quantity measures when assessing scientific leadership. 2, the effect of increased global competition on U.S. leadership in S&T, particularly the ability to attract and retain talent and the impacts on the economic strength. Section 4 includes possible bottom-line messages that the board could convey in the piece, using international collaboration in research as a mechanism to maintain scientific leadership, continuing the focus on basic research, and a need for strategy for consistent, predictable research funding for the long term, beyond a month or two. So while these messages are written as separate section in the outline, they could also be woven throughout the companion piece. And finally, we envision using 2 to 3 vignettes throughout the companion that will highlight fields of science that would be of interest to Congress and the current administration. The vignettes would discuss U.S. scientific leadership in each area and the contributing factors leading to the field's current status. Example vignettes might focus on the following: artificial intelligence, quantum information science, high-performance computing, water research, biotechnology, nuclear energy, and a few that are less in another area, which could even be agriculture and food. I would now like to open the floor to entire board for discussion. This includes thought you might have on strategy and scope or specific content for this piece. Yes, Bint.
So I like very much the idea of releasing a larger number of smaller items for two different reasons. One, they're more absorbable, and second, it keeps attention flowing. And I think drawing attention to the STP reports is actually in our interest. So I like the idea of doing something, a larger number of small things to draw attention to particular items.
And that would fall nicely into the purview of what is put on the web, too, in terms of pieces that can come out in a periodic manner. Yeah, Vic.
Just to endorse what Vint also said, particularly I have a self-interest in, the things that we acquire on the skilled technical workforce, whereas I think these small pieces will come out will not necessarily be findings and definitive because it's a moving target all of the time. This would help us in our skilled technical workforce to come up with observations and small pieces that tie into the statistical data that you have for indicators. So I would also endorse this, many more small reports coming out in time in a timely manner. And I think also that addresses the issue we brought up yesterday of timeliness and keeping the interest, of the topic du jour at the time for particularly legislators and administrators.
We really want people to come to the site periodically, not just once a year, and having these interest pieces along with this companion statement also putting out is important. Bob.
I want to speak to the content of this particular one. And I'm worried about naive readers having only the frame of nation-state competition as they consume this information. And so I put a plug in again for some content in this report that speaks to how the scientific enterprise is global already. And I'm afraid without that, this could be used in harmful ways. So just a plug for collaboration and how important that is, and the fact that the product of science includes a dissemination step that is public and therefore consumable for free globally.
Follow up with that. You mean, Bob, that the synergy among collaborations would create better science for all international entities? Is that what you're talking about?
I'm worried this will be viewed. Look at the debate we're having right now about internation trade and how much more complex that issue is than just winners and losers. So I want to make sure that we educate in this thematic thing, as well as have, the charts that are just, that we all have seared in our mind of China going like that, is just one chart, and it's much more complicated than that. We ought to try to educate. I'm not sure I addressed your question.
Well, I think the better argument would be that everybody benefits from this interaction, just like in trade. I mean, and not look at it like a zero-sum game in some way, right? But I think I wouldn't rely on the altruism of it because, taxpayers want to support things going on, and they're going to help the United States. So I think it's a fine line. I agree in part with what Bob's saying, but I think you also want to show that there's an advantage to doing this for our enterprise.
And building on both of your statements, I would like to have the flavor of the piece too be, and maybe it's in the bottom line section where NSF is engaged in international activities because we recognize that the way that we are competitive is to be collaborative in addition to competitive. Yeah.
Let's see, I agree completely with what's been said, but I also like the notion of the so what section, because I think that a thoughtful so what section is of critical importance here. We tend to look at dollars or count researchers, but because it's quantifiable. And in those cases, a country like China is going to win. So I think some thought given to that perspective is desperately needed by our policymakers, because while our focus is on advancing the science, there are others focused on the national security aspects, economic competitive aspects, and so forth. And I think we really need to establish some thoughtful context around this.
In the section where we talk about STEM education and trying to think about the U.S. in global context, could we include a little bit more nuanced information there that has a little more to do with teaching quality and teaching supply? Because if all we're looking at are outputs, at looking at TIMSS and PISA scores, we're not actually addressing what is very distinctive about the differences between the United States and our investments in STEM prior to college and other countries. The only caution I would say is that some of the conventional metrics that we use to compare ourselves are misleading. So it would take a little bit of thought to get data. There are other data available, and we sort of talked about this before, but I would urge that we not contribute to the ongoing feeling that there's some output problem when in fact there's a huge input problem.
Thanks, Deborah. Roger, and then James.
I'd like to build a little on what Ruth said and other comments that have implied, and that is that the so what side of this. There are growing numbers of enterprises in China and other countries that are coming to the U.S. with funding for the so what, and they want to find those that will be partnered back in their home countries. That's a good thing or a bad thing, depending upon you're the entrepreneur. But the outcome of this is more money into entrepreneurism and innovation. So I don't know if it belongs in this one or not, but it's part of the so what. It can be seen either way. And there's a growing number of those examples that in me, with my small amount of contact, know about. So there must be many, many more. So, but it represents an opportunity, but something that may want to be mentioned in this kind of a report. The topic of the current, of the one we're talking about.
Just following on that, when I look at big increase in funding for science from China, I think, wow, that's great, a lot more science. The real thing for us is that we want to be a player. We want to be invited to interact with and be able to invite the top people in the world, and that's why we need to go. So it's not per se bad that other countries are, this is really all of the points that you guys were making. It's not bad that other countries are making massive investments in science. The threat to us is that we get left behind and left out ultimately. And so I just don't want to make it sound like it's bad to invest a lot of money, that some other country is investing a lot of money in science, because that's really good.
Yes, okay, James.
Yeah, I agree with Peter's point, but to speak to the point that Bob made, we may need to put this in some kind of context. So what he expressed was a set of values that scientists and science holds with regard to international cooperation and how we understand it. And we share that particular value. So we don't really have to talk about that. And we rarely do talk about that because it's the way in which we're trained, it's the way in which we understand things are, cooperation, cross borders, and so on. But that's not necessarily the way in which everyone out there looks at it. So we may want to think about a kind of a values, I wouldn't call it value statement, but a preamble or a contextual statement that really makes that particular point as we then move into other aspects of what the report is. I think that's really important. It's one of those clear cases where the fellow yesterday talked about how, everybody doesn't necessarily share your particular perspective on kinds of things, but you assume that they do, and then you just jump into the middle of it, and people are saying, what is this? What are you talking about? So I just think we need to think about that. Does that make sense? Okay.
Bob.
Let me just say on the other hand, not to James, but to earlier comments. So this country has enjoyed a benefit that others hadn't, and that is the immigration of scientific talent that stayed here. And back to Deborah's point, we got away with a decayed K through 12 STEM because we had great higher education and we brought in people from other countries. The rise of other countries on this, and if people stay home, could have like a double whammy effect on us because we don't have the infrastructure K through 12 to produce our own, and we don't have access to immigration. Somehow, if we can say that without politically blowing everything up, it would be truthful, I think.
I think one thing, in listening to all of you, one thing for us to think about, because we did raise it as an option, is a couple of companion pieces. And I could almost see one that is really focused around what you all have been talking about, which is the educational component and the importance of international collaboration. That includes immigrants that have come into our country, stayed here, that there's a threat that if they don't consider, they don't continue to come or they stay home, this is what the impact will be on our workforce. So one that's as much workforce driven and training driven as one that is kind of a piece of that we've just had in these press releases. And I hope we all recognize, I'm sure we all do, that whenever we say science, we include engineering also, just making sure that we have that in there also. Yes, Vint.
So I'm taking up this idea of possibly more than one companion piece. I would distinguish between doing science and taking advantage of science. We discovered in the course of discussing doing science that the STEM-capable workforce was an important part of the equation, not just people with advanced degrees, whether they are homegrown or come to the U.S. from outside. Taking advantage of science is another aspect of all this, and you still need a STEM-capable workforce to do that. A lot of it's engineering as opposed to deep research. So it's possible that by framing both of those discussions, we can explain what it's going to take to put this country in a position where it can take advantage of science as well as doing it. The point that got made yesterday that we had done great research on solar panels, but most of the production is coming from someplace else, is a kind of worked example of not taking advantage of science.
Question.
Just one point is that if you focus on what it takes for a STEM-capable workforce / skill technical workforce, you get into these deeper issues of the investment into education. And you can make that argument without being politicized. You can just say, look, we need these workers. We have gotten evidence from different sectors about the future need for these workers. And then if you frame it that we have to have that investment so that we can then maintain in terms of our technological competitiveness and global competitiveness, then it looks like what you're talking about is the investment that needs to be made from both state, local, federal agencies, as well as other partners like business and academia. And that is not a political statement. That becomes an investment strategy.
Thanks, Vic, and I want to thank everyone for your comments. As usual, they're always very helpful and insightful, and staff will incorporate these suggestions into their thinking as they go forward and report back to the board. I will finish now with my reflections on my term as chair of the board of SEP. So I want to say that it's been really great working with the whole team here in the SBO office, including NCSES, and getting to know them so much better. You know, taking on this role for Kelvin, I told him last night that he has big shoes to fill, not because his feet are big, but simply because he stuffs a lot in them that then I've had to cover for. So I'm really appreciating having the opportunity to be able to be a leader in this area. What's particularly gratifying is to see how much all of you have embraced science and engineering indicators is so important to all of us. Because again, I think with the topics and the way we're interacting with the board office on this, it's really gotten everyone engaged, and that's really wonderful to see. We've had some accomplishments, and I think especially we've set as a priority making certain that it's not just one big telephone book, but actually we've got a lot of things that are coming out, and that's very exciting. I think some of the major accomplishments that I would like to brag about for the NSBO staff and NCSES is are a few things. Publication of the infographic statement on career pathways. You may recall that a few months back, but it's really wonderful, very interactive. And publications of indicators 2018. There's some key changes that have been involved in that, changing the way the state data tool is produced so staff could incorporate periodic data updates, creation of a new chapter on innovation, rebranding the overview as an overview of the state of U.S. S&E in the global context. SEP contributed to state one-pagers, which is really great. We've gotten a lot of good reception for that. And we've also collaborated a lot with External Engagement Committee, and I think that's really great too, and I'd like to see us continue that as you all move forward. And also this strong collaboration between SEP and STW in collaboration in helping to work towards a companion piece of indicators on the importance of building a STEM-capable U.S. workforce and the statement, the first formal statement on the skilled technical workforce, which is important. So as we go forward, as you all go forward with this, I think what's been important in accelerating any progress that we've got going in the future is that really sustaining the kind of issues that were raised in the workshop. I thought the workshop in January was phenomenal. It helped build a trust between NCSES, the board, and everyone involved. That's really important for moving forward so we can all understand where everyone's coming from. I would actually suggest in the future that this becomes more of an annual activity to have a workshop like this, because a one-off just gets you started but doesn't allow you to continue to build on that trust and to move forward. I'm just so delighted with the relationship that I see developing among these groups. And I think that, again, moving forward, SEP and EE working closely together is going to be also very important, maybe setting up some metrics by what you think you can achieve by going forward with the two together. And then also SEP must continue to provide policymakers with high quality, timely and useful information and advice. We've worked a lot on the data, but actually thinking about policy has been, haven't had as much time for that, had a lot to do, but I think some of this is the discussions we're having today actually ties in with that policy also. So I want to just quickly turn to any of the committee members for any reflections that they might have before we conclude this session. Vint.
Just one small observation, that the NCSES team that produces this report has demonstrated their ability to change after many years of producing the same sort of thing over and over. And I think that's pretty impressive.
Comments other than woohoo, thank you, thank you, thank you, all of you. Okay, so thank you for a productive meeting. With no further business before the committee, this meeting is adjourned.
Okay, Punch, Committee on Strategy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning. I would like to welcome everyone to the open meeting of the Committee on Strategy. Committee members are Bob Groves, Carl Leinberger, Steve Mayo, Emilio Moran, and Anila Sargent. The focus of our meeting this morning is to receive an update on both the FY 2018 appropriations for NSF and FY 2019 budget request to Congress. And like the other chairs have done, I will provide some thoughts on this past year as the chair of Committee on Strategy. You have in tab 9.1 of the Diligent Board Book and in the board portal the minutes from the Committee on Strategy open session at the February 21, 2018 board meeting. Are there any comments or corrections on the minutes from either meeting? Hearing none, no objections, the minutes stand as approved. Our next agenda item will be to provide the board with an update of FY 2018 appropriations. We will also hear more on the FY 2019 budget request and further details about the Convergence accelerators. I'm sure you're all excited and waiting to listen to that, and big ideas. I believe we received updated slides yesterday, which should be in your board book. Today, Director Cordova and Tony Giovanni, Deputy Director for the Budget Division, will provide additional information on these two important NSF investments. Dr. Cordova, would you like to begin the discussion?
Yes, thank you very much, Panch. So if we can have the first slide. Whoops. All right. Yes, so this is an outline of how this session will go. And we're going to start with the budget from that Tony DiGiovanni will present. So he'll talk about the 2018 outcome and then the 2019 request. And then we'll go into the convergence accelerators and the big ideas. Tony.
Thank you, Dr. Cordova. So these are the topics that I will cover in this presentation. I'll try to be very brief so that we can move on to the other items that Dr. Cordova mentioned. This presentation provides updates to information that the National Science Board received in the closed session in February, which was prior to the enactment of the FY 2018 appropriations and the submission of the FY 2019 request. So there's a little more information we can share now. Please note that all information presented in this open session today is publicly available information. And in the closed session later, we'll talk about some of the details behind the decisions that were made. This slide presents the total funding levels for NSF in fiscal years 2017, 18, and 19. And the important thing to note is the amount for the 2018 enacted is about $295 million more than FY17 enacted and the FY19 request. This slide presents some of the noteworthy items from the FY 2018 appropriation. As it says, the report language supports the importance of NSF's overall investment. The report language included a statement reflecting Congress's growing concern that China and other competitors are outpacing the United States in terms of research spending, and that is a theme that we've already heard this morning. The report included strong support for NSF's research infrastructure major facilities and directed construction of 3 regional class research vessels. You may recall that NSF requested 2 ships in 18, and the House included 0 ships, and the Senate included 3 ships, and that's where we ended up. And also importantly, you'll note the Hispanic serving institutions increased, and that we, again, have no directorate level allocations. So that's another important piece of flexibility for NSF. The FY 2018 appropriation was enacted on March 23rd, and we are in the middle of the development of the current plan, which we will present to Congress. It's been drafted, it requires OMB clearance, and we expect to submit it to Congress by May 7th. They have a 15-day timeline to approve, and we anticipate that we will receive that timely. The FY19 President's budget request was released February 12th. I will talk about it a little bit, present some items of note. Here again, you'll see the 19 request is $295 million less than 18 and flat to 17. The first item I want to quickly note is that NSF proposes to employ a stewardship model for the Big Ideas funding in 2019. And these are the funding levels included in the budget request. And Dr. Torno will go into more detail on this later. Another thing in 19 budget request was that NSF proposed a new organizational structure for 2 convergence accelerators that will each focus on one of the big ideas, harnessing the data revolution and the future of work at the human technology frontier, each for $30 million. And Dr. Torno will also go into more detail on this. A few other items of note: the Antarctic Infrastructure Modernization for Science construction project, or the AIMS, is in the 19 request for $104 million, which would be the first year of an 8-year funding profile and would result in a total project cost of $355 million. The SBE Directorate, important thing to note there is that NCSES is flat to FY17, while the SBS Science research programs were reduced in the request. And the Graduate Research Fellowship Program will support 1,500 new fellows in FY19. This slide talks about the major research equipment and facilities construction account. So the construction projects in that MREFC account. This is the dollars associated with constructing 2 vessels in FY19 and support versus support for 3 in FY18. That's the reason for that reduction. And we'll see how that plays out in Congress. They've been giving us 3 ships for several years now, so directing us to do 3 ships. And the DKIST and LSST funding follows the profile that has been established, so they're on track. Finally, for AOAM, a funding level of $334 million. The reduction from previous years reflects the completion of our headquarters building, this wonderful facility, and we no longer have included funding in our request for that. It maintains full staffing, current staffing levels of 1,310 full-time equivalent employees, and the funding level for 19 includes no cost of living adjustment per OMB instructions. And that's everything.
Thank you, Tony, and we'll just go directly into the strategy part.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
So I don't know. So if I can invite my colleagues to come to the table now. So what we heard from Tony very quickly was the outcome of the 2018. So that's appropriated dollars. And then the presentation, it's a recap of what you've already heard about, but with a little more detail on the 2019 President's budget request. Okay, so 19 still has a long ways to go. So now we're going into the 2019 planning. How are we going to actually implement this budget, especially with respect to the big ideas and the convergence accelerators? So with me here to talk about the stewardship model are Jim Carosa and Joanne Turno. On the convergence accelerators, I'll talk about what is a convergence accelerator. And Don will continue with how does a convergence accelerator work and how we're launching them. And as part of that discussion, Faye Cook and Jim Carosa will give you examples of what is in a convergence accelerator, some ideas to start them off with. And then Barry Johnson will talk about partnerships, because I think you all remember that partnerships with the private sector is a big part of making a convergence accelerator go. And then we'll finish up this part of the discussion with Susie Iacono talking about the big idea that hasn't yet been presented to you all, NSF 2026, and the notion of an idea machine and launching this in August of this year. On FY 2020, we don't have anything to report. There'll be an upcoming June retreat with the senior leadership to frame the 2020 submission, and then we'll schedule a telecon with the committee, Punch, and then after that we'll have the July meeting to further discuss it. Okay, so let's start talking about the big idea stewardship model, which Tony introduced with numerically the numbers and where those are going to go, be housed. But now for a little more detail is Jim Carosa.
Thank you, France. So we've met with the NSB before to actually discuss the big ideas, but in the intervening time, we at NSF have really worked hard on moving forward significantly in laying the foundations for these big ideas, and we wanted to give you a brief update on that. So really, across the foundation, we have working groups with program directors, we have steering committees at the division director, division leadership level, and groups with AD leadership. We've been working really hard to, across all of the big ideas, which you see listed up there, those are the 6 big research ideas listed vertically there, to lay the foundation for fiscal 19. As the director noted in her remarks yesterday, in some cases we've actually issued new solicitations and dear colleague letters in support of that. So as you see here in this diagram, we have the directorates and the offices as the verticals here and the big ideas as horizontals. And of course, this notion of having verticals that cut across multiple directorates, that's not new here in the foundation. But what is new here is, I think, the extent to which we're making investments, as well as how we're going to be managing and operating those. And I just wanted to say a few words on that, because this is sort of a different approach to how we do convergence here within the NSF. So we've had leadership meetings to talk about this notion of stewardship and what that means to us. And so the intellectual directions for these cross-cutting topics really, I mean, it cuts across all directorates. So all directorates, the steering committees, the working groups, and the AD groups will be contributing the ideas, the intellectual capital to what will be happening there. What's a little bit different this time is almost in a financial or in a business management sense how that's going to be managed. So, for instance, if I take harnessing the data revolution, we have a planned investment of $30 million in that for the big idea. That will be managed within SIZE. That doesn't mean that SIZE or the SIZE directorate or SIZE program directors or division directors set the intellectual direction or make determinations about how that's going to be spent. That is going to be coming from these new, the steering committee and the working groups that actually cut across that. So each directorate, as you've seen, as Tony has mentioned, will manage that, will steward that. But the ideas, the decisions about the programmatics, what the solicitations are going to look like, what the intellectual directions will be done by these cross-cutting groups that cut across all directorates. In the case of harnessing the data revolution, all 7 directorates and 2 offices are involved in that. So in some sense, this doesn't belong to any one directorate. No big idea belongs to one directorate. It's going to be managed by a directorate, but intellectually owned collectively across. Maybe I'll just close, and we can come back for questions and additional discussion. To remind you that, of course, the big ideas are wonderful. We continue our foundational research programs, our core research programs in all of the areas across the big ideas. For instance, in harnessing the data revolution, we still have our big data solicitation and solicitations within other directorates. The big ideas are separate from those, and they are also separate from the accelerators, which we'll be talking about next.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Joanne, did you want to add anything?
I'll just add just one sentence here, and then anything that comes up in questions is that we recognize, so first of all, a lot of work, as Jim and France have said earlier, a lot of work has already begun on these, and so we want to acknowledge the input of the staff and thank them for the hard work in getting these up and running. And we are very cognizant of, in setting up the management of these, we are very cognizant of workload concerns, and we are working hard to connect these to our renewing NSF efforts, particularly on the things that will, in the area of streamlining, simplifying, standardizing, as well as our making IT work for us. So these are definitely moving along hand in hand.
Okay, thank you. So let's move now to the Convergence accelerators. And of course, we're open to questions, but we'll kind of finish our presentations, I would propose first, because some questions might be answered. So what's a Convergence accelerator? So as this slide tries to summarize, it's a standalone entity. It's new in that the government is doing this accelerator instead of private entities, and we'll explain some of those distinctions. And of course, the purpose is to accelerate research translational activities in areas of national importance, and those will be convergent activities. It'll be a home, each accelerator, for more use-inspired or application-driven research, and hopefully advance ideas from concept to deliverables, which distinguishes it, as Jim was talking about, from the foundational big ideas investments, which we don't really know what the outcome is going to be. Here we have more intentional outcomes defined. So some of the key characteristics are listed here. They have, there are cohorts of teams, and that'll be explained in a little more detail by Don. They're intentionally managed and directed. They have seed investment. There'll be a competition aspect to it. They'll have intensive educational part and also a lot of strong mentorship. They'll attract partnership, and Barry will be talking about how we're conceiving that. A very important aspect is they'll have a fixed term, and then we'll go on to do other endeavors, other goals within these accelerators, or close them and start other accelerators. They, a key characteristic here is that they are continually fed by basic research and discovery. How do they differ from the foundational research? We talked a little bit about that. They're more intentional. They can foster a range of approaches and solutions, but all pointed in common direction. And they really feed between a top-down strategic directions and a bottom-up creative approach. And why NSF-sponsored accelerators? We fund basic research. Private accelerators target individual startups. We want to accelerate the process of convergent research, but we want to have deliverables, and we believe in the areas that we've selected to be convergent accelerators that they are ripe for deliverables. We are directed in the accelerators towards outcomes that are not in niche market areas as a private startup or private incubator accelerator would be. And the intention here is to achieve goals that will push translation farther and faster. And as you know, we have a number of programs, Barry leads that effort here, that do try to push translation farther and faster. And this is yet another a unique, creative way. We'll convene cohorts of teams with unique skill sets around broad national goals, something that your private incubators or accelerators, think Y Combinator or Techstars, does not do. How will the research in a convergence accelerator be defined? Well, we'll start, NSF will, with a few tracks that can define focus areas within the accelerator. Those tracks will have specific goals and outcomes and deliverables. And we'll be hosting simultaneously, as we get these kicked off, workshops that will to form teams and solicit additional tracks that are recommended by the community. So I'd like now for Jim Carosa to give us, just so it's a little more tangible for you all, some idea of tracks. What does the track look like with an accelerator? Well, one of the accelerators, as you know, that we've chosen is harnessing the data revolution. And Jim has a couple of ideas for tracks in that.
Right, so these are meant just to be exemplars. We had 2 retreats actually over the last month to talk about the convergence accelerators, and we ended up finding it very valuable to just put out a couple of specific projects, again, just as examples to help us in our thinking about all of those adjectives that the director just mentioned: intentionality, managed, milestones. And so let me give you 2 that might be possible for harnessing the data revolution. The first is an advanced science data infrastructure that's interoperable and has open architecture. Actually, this came up yesterday in some of the discussions of the board. Think of this as a distributed, interoperable collection or federation of data repositories with open standards that then enable discoverability, access, and use of heterogeneous scientific data across many disciplines. This kind of infrastructure could also network together data coming from the large-scale facilities and could link in third-party data coming from other sources in those science domains as well. So if you think about what it might take to do something like this, you can see those characteristics of the accelerator that the director mentioned and how different it is from, say, the standard 3-year research grants that are central to so much of what we do here. It's intentional, you know. There's a statement, or I gave you a statement about what it would do. There are defined outcomes. There would be milestones. There would be deliverables. It would need to be agile and more directed. You could imagine multiple teams coming together to build pieces of this end-to-end system. You could imagine a bake-off between different ideas, different approaches to how to architect and to build these pieces. So that's one example. Another example might be what we call we've been calling an open knowledge network. So this is sort of a higher level, semantic level information infrastructure to help in the discovery of new knowledge when you have scientific data coming from different sources. We think that effective human-centered interfaces to large-scale knowledge networks are going to be critical in the future for advanced discovery. So think of Siri or Cortana or Alexis for science domains rather than the particular domains they're operating in right now. Think about the dramatic change in search engines when they've moved from just being keyword-based to being more question and answer. There are big knowledge networks, proprietary in those cases, that are sitting behind those kinds of advanced human-centered information systems. And so this would be another great example, helping us in our thinking, again, thinking about intentionality, defined outcomes, milestones, deliverables, agility, multiple contributing teams. This also has that.
Thank you, Jim. And so now Faye will talk about the other Convergence accelerator. We're going to start with the future of work at Human Technology Frontier and give you 3 examples of tracks that could be within that.
And I'll just reiterate what we've already heard from Jim Carosa, that these are just examples, just exemplars. So we can imagine in the Convergence Accelerator on the future of work at the Human Technology Frontier, 3 tracks being smarter manufacturing environments, smarter classrooms, and even smarter cyber security at scale. So smarter manufacturing environments. We envision building on the foundational research that we have in the big idea, smarter adaptive collaborations between humans and machines using artificial intelligence, building on the foundational research that we have on the work that goes on in classrooms by teachers and students. We envision intelligent cognitive assistance in a smart classroom that can enhance student learning with teachers. And thinking about cybersecurity at scale, identifying and mitigating vulnerabilities using artificial intelligence. So again, these are 3 examples, all of which are building on some really important foundational research that is taking place, will take place, and it's going to accelerate these to these new smart workplace environments.
Thank you, Faye. And now Dawn Tilbury will tell us how this could work.
So again, this is how it could work. We've had a lot of discussions about this, but I think this seems to resonate with a few people, and I'll talk about how this builds on things that we've done before at NSF. So the input to the Convergence accelerators is the PIs and partners of NSF and all the basic research results that they've been developing over the years. So we imagine by building on that foundational research with the PIs and the partners in the community to start by seeding some teams. These teams could be organic, meaning they're already working together or they know people that they think they'd like to work with on this topic that we propose. Or we would have structured workshops where people who are interested could come together, maybe with a couple people they know, and meet others who might be added to their team to get that team together. Obviously, for all of these Convergence accelerators, the teams would need to be multidisciplinary and have a diverse membership. Think multiple disciplines, faculty and students, maybe graduate and undergraduate, industry partners, maybe people from other government agencies. These teams we expect to be very diverse and reasonably large, maybe 6 to 8 or even 10 people in one of these teams. So once the teams come together around the topic, they would write a very short proposal to become an official team that would go through the team formation. And so that short proposal would identify who's in the team, what are their expertise, and why do they think they're the right team and have the right expertise to address the problem. And so that would be reviewed probably by NSF program officers, and then they would be selected to go into this team formation phase, which we envision as an intense, maybe 6 or so months team formation in a cohort, so about 20 teams all coming together. And they would spend at least a week on site together in the same place, doing a lot of education, as the director mentioned. You could imagine that the faculty in each of those teams would give short lectures about their expertise because they're so diverse, right? You want the social scientists to talk about their approach to the future of work, and the computer scientists to talk about the type of machine learning they envision applying. So the teams would learn from each other in that cohort, and they would also have mentors that would be helping them, understand convergence, understand team dynamics and ideation. So after that intense 1 week, there would be a weekly check-ins with a moderator or a program manager to try to keep the teams on track. And this is where the intentional management of those teams comes in. Also, that by doing that intentional management and oversight of the teams during that intense formation phase, the moderator or the program manager understands a lot better about what the team is and what their capabilities are and how well they're doing in their pushing their convergent research forwards. So after that intense formation phase, we envision that they'll all come together again for a couple of days and have a pitch. So each team would do a pitch about what they've learned and what they plan to do next, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And at the end of that pitch day, the big awards are given out. So some subset of the teams, not all, will get a big award to do more convergent research. Maybe, $1 or $2 million a year, or however long we think that will be. This is something still being discussed. But it's not just the review based on 15 minutes, right? Someone's been overseeing these teams for the last 6 months. There's a lot more information than just 15 minutes of an oral presentation. So we believe that that merit review at the pitch day will incorporate all that different information, and we would have NSF program managers, maybe industry partners coming to that pitch, and making those decisions about which teams will get the large research awards. And then again, there would be this cohort structure would remain, and there would be maybe monthly check-ins, and maybe a semi-annual review where they all come back together and share what they've learned, and again, learn from each other. We think this will really help accelerate the research with multiple teams all working on the same topic and moving forwards. And then at the end, we envision that there would be a prize that would be awarded for the best outcome overall. So that would be some sort of competition, again, judged by NSF program managers, merit reviewers, industry partners, et cetera. So the next slide. So we see that this model of the convergence accelerators builds on a lot of things we've been doing in NSF over the last several years. The I-Core network model that has teams and cohorts coming together in an intensive mentored educational environment. Now, I-Core is to start companies, whereas this is to push convergent research forward, but we think that a lot of the lessons learned from I-Core could be applied here. The collective impact model that we're using in NSF includes where you have multiple teams working together in all addressing the same problem to try to move the needle in a specific direction. Again, this is a different direction, but we think that model is useful. We've formed ideas labs over the years, and we have a lot of experience in developing teams. And I'll mention in March, Barry will talk a little bit more about this maybe. We had an industry-inspired workshop in quantum to try to bring together industry who were interested to coordinate on basic research in quantum and bring together what are the topics and what are the right universities to bring in an industry university cooperative research center. So we think that kind of workshop that we've had experience doing, and the industry at that workshop expressed specific interest in having more such workshops, including on 2 of the big ideas that we want to have for the Convergence Accelerators. So we are ready to launch those workshops this summer. So the new things that we're adding to the Convergence Accelerators are this selection by the pitch instead of a 15-page research proposal, and this is going to make things go faster. But as I mentioned, it's not only the 15-minute pitch. There's 6 months of information on that team before they make the decision. And this competition for monetary prizes, as NSF hasn't done that on a big scale, but obviously other agencies have with really great inspirational results.
Great. Thank you, Don. And now Barry will talk about partnerships. I want to thank Ruth. David was very influential in getting us to expand our idea about partnerships and the convergence accelerators.
Thank you. One of the exciting things about the convergence accelerators is I believe that they provide an outstanding opportunity for partnerships and actually enable partnerships. Perhaps just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, I believe they require partnerships in order to be successful. And so the model that we've been examining is to determine ways that we can bring together the deep subject matter experts from fundamental research with the industry and other organizations that have a deep understanding of the applied and the applications that are available for that fundamental research. I think there are multiple benefits to this. One is that it enables those that are really knowledgeable of applications to understand better the outcomes that can be achieved using the fundamental research results, but it also helps those engaged in fundamental research to understand better the needs of the application. Dawn mentioned the workshop that we held on quantum technologies just recently, and one of the major outcomes from that workshop was that we need to get these two groups together. These groups need to communicate, they need to build upon one another and influence one another's activities. And so we believe that the convergence accelerators can bring these groups together and really be focused on basic research that is use-inspired, but is pre-competitive from an industrial standpoint so that you can actually enable multiple organizations to be engaged collaboratively in the partnership. The other exciting thing that we see in this particular model is that you could actually apply this on an individual team basis. So a team could have a partner that would be collaborating with them, but you could also apply it on a cohort basis, where an entire cohort might have a collection of partners that would collaboratively work with that cohort. The outcomes, we believe, are going to be use-inspired fundamental research, potentially jointly funded with partners helping to fund and support that activity, providing access to the partnership teams, to the intellectual property that comes out of that, building relationships and delivering increased value to society for the outcomes of the research that's conducted. So we really see a great opportunity as well as a great need for partnerships in the conduct of the convergence accelerators.
Great. Thank you very much, Barry. So now we've discussed two of the three items that we promised you in this session, the stewardship of the big ideas, the convergence accelerators, and what a concept of what those are about. And now the last item is NSF 2026, and Susie Iacono will speak to how we're conceptualizing that.
Okay, thank you very much. So as the director has said, you haven't heard much about this big idea, this process big idea, and that is because we have a large group of people across NSF working on a new concept called the NSF 2026 Idea Machine. So what is that? So this is a new approach for NSF. We plan to surface and identify future directions for NSF research and education. So we plan to do this by intentionally bringing in our research communities and the public and helping us think about big ideas right at the beginning. So we have designed this as a 10-step competition, starting with a broad call for new ideas on research themes. And just about anybody can submit their big ideas to this idea machine. So we've set a lower limit of age 14. And so we're hoping that high school students, high school classes will come up with their big research ideas and submit them to NSF. So then after a down select, because we're hoping to get several hundred at least, we'll invite candidates to create video pitches about these big ideas. And these are going to be available for public comment. So we'll have a little bit of crowdsourcing happening in our idea machine. And so these will all eventually go to a blue ribbon panel for judging. And the best ideas will receive public recognition, cash prizes in some instances, and other types of awards. Next slide. So this is our timeline. We're going to launch in August of this year. We're very excited about this. And by August 2019, we'll be able to announce the first set of winners. And so we're hoping that with this approach, we're going to create the next set of NSF's big ideas, or Big Ideas 2.0. And so now I think I turn it over to Punch.
Well, thank you. That concludes our presentation. We're open for questions and discussion.
Thank you. This is a wonderful, even the illustration of how we are all working as a team really is fantastic. And that shows how Convergence accelerators, in fact, will work as teams. So this is a great example that you have set. So thank you so much for the presentations. We'll take questions. I have a few questions myself, but I'm going to hold it off and give a chance for my colleagues to ask the questions. Ruth will go first. And anybody who wants to, please make sure that you raise your hands so that I know.
First of all, congratulations. This is really exciting, and I have no doubt that this will morph and change because you'll learn a lot as you go. I want to focus on this last idea machine, which is incredibly exciting. I love it. I would urge you to be ready in case you get thousands instead of hundreds. The other question I have is, what if the best ideas come from China?
So one thing that we have said is that the United States of America will take big ideas from anywhere that it can get them. But one of the rules will probably be that the lead for the submission will have to be a U.S. citizen.
Good. I think I lay that out because you have to think that through. Because if you open this up and advertise it broadly, which I would encourage, you literally could get ideas from all over the world, so you need to be prepared for that.
Right, and again, I think they could be team members because if they have good ideas, we would like to use them.
And these are ideas, not proposals.
Yes, that's right. These are ideas for research themes, not projects.
Could you go back to the Convergence accelerator phases slide? Yeah, that one. So you talked a lot about team formation, and then it's only at step 2 that there's a large grant. Do you anticipate providing funds for the earlier stages so people can actually get together and travel? And
Absolutely. We envision that the team formation phase would have a small grant. You need to pay the students. You need to have travel funds, but it's not going to be a huge award.
Right. So
the team formation phase and the workshops, of course, will be funded.
Great. And I have a comment on the NSF 2026 slide. You could perhaps go there. So I love the graphic, but hopefully one thing which won't be taken from this graphic is that as the cogs of the machine turn, people don't get ground up in it.
We've discussed that, actually.
We predicted that this question would be one of the first ones to come up, and we're saying, please don't take this too literally. This is a concept graphic, and so, this is not like Charlie Chaplin in modern times, right? This is people working together.
Vint?
It's obvious that's a cognitive graph. -2. Look, I reflect on where ideas come from, and as an engineer, the best ideas come from problems. And so focusing on problems is a terrific idea to focus applied research. I would point out that acceleration sometimes comes from framing the right question or framing the right idea. So a classic example of this is DARPA when it said the grand challenge was autonomous vehicles. I can't think of a better way of illustrating acceleration by the way in which they carried out that particular challenge. The rate at which we have achieved autonomy in vehicles is nothing short of astonishing in less than a decade or so. So I think that I'm not persuaded yet that the processes that you've been describing capture this notion of what are the problems. So, for example, if you want to make a big impact and you want to have it cover a fairly large range of activity, if you go to industry and you try to find out what problems big problems do they have, is there any commonality across the industries that you interrogate? Could that be a way of identifying a problem whose solution would have broad impact. So I guess I'm urging you to think in problem terms and to mine places in the research community and in industry and frankly in government to discover what their big problems are and then ask whether you can contribute to their solution.
Yeah. So, yeah, so that's a great observation. That's why we presented these few exemplars. These are, for example, two big problems for the scientific engineering communities, these interoperable databases and these being able to search open semantic information in a much better way. Those are huge things, and I think, Vint, you've pointed them out in some of the big projects that we have, the NEONs and LSSTs and so forth. So what we said earlier was that we'll host workshops we'll start with a few tracks that represent problems that we have that are enormous. And even last night at my table, they were talking about the semantic databases. And then we'll be soliciting through workshops that will start immediately this summer to additional tracks recommend. And the community is, as you said, we should think of the industry community as well as the science community.
Yeah, so France and everybody else, I think this represents just a huge amount of progress in thinking on all three of these items, and really want to congratulate you for doing all the obvious work that was involved in this. Question about the convergence accelerators. So they're kind of different in the sense that they actually include deliverables, and I'm wondering if there's any consideration of some part of the funding mechanism being contracts as opposed to other mechanisms, which is something that NSF doesn't really do.
Does anybody want to take that?
So I'll just make the observation. I think we haven't gotten down to those levels of detail, but it has been observed in our discussions that these look a little bit more like cooperative agreements than they do sort of the standard research grants. And so, you know, the notion that there will be these gated phases where some teams may go forward and others not. And so I think that will be built into the process, whether that's a contract or not.
Yeah, and I could imagine that the kind of deliverables that you're talking about are not the kind of usual deliverables that one might get in a DoD contract or something like that. So, but.
Yeah, I agree that this is really interesting and promising, and I congratulate the team for putting the ideas together. I'm wondering if we've learned anything from the engineering research centers and the science technology centers, which had a bit of this idea to them. Do we have any best practices from there that we can carry on, and things we learned that don't work from ERCs and STCs?
So Barry and Dawn?
So absolutely, they were part of the team that put together the vision for how these would work, you know, what the ERCs. So these are not ERCs, but they have a lot of the ideas of building teams and workshops and managing phases and things like that.
I think we also, out of our Industry University Cooperative Research Centers program, we have the partnership model that I was describing is really embodied in that program as well, where we have 76 centers across the country with an average of 20 industry members and other government labs as members of these centers that are helping define the problem and helping guide the research that's being conducted by those centers.
One quick follow-up, if I could, that in those partnerships, often they lasted beyond the NSF support.
They do, absolutely.
In fact, that was a goal that industrial partnerships would help keep it funding, and I know the two I was familiar with kept it going like that.
We actually have 35 to 40 IUCRCs that have graduated from NSF support and are continuing to conduct research and collaborate with those industry members.
No, I just have a quick question. Has there been any report on the success of these 76? I would really be curious about that. That's the only thing that struck me in this, in terms of how we think about kind of basic fundamental research, academic research, as it relates to kind of industry applied, and how those two come together as equal partners. and go forward with regard to basic research. So it would be nice to know if there's been any reports or anything about that in terms of what difficulties were there. You know what I'm talking about?
Well, first of all, sure, on the engineering research centers, we have a whole National Academy report that came in a year ago or so, and that is very much influencing our next generation of engineering research centers that we're going to announce. I don't know if for the IUCRCs, Barry.
We do, for the IUCRCs, we do an annual collection of reports that describe not only the multiple sources of funding that come into these centers, but the outcomes, for example, the intellectual property that's created, startup companies that are created, the licensings of the technology to the large industry members. And so there's an annual progress report that we assemble for those centers. Just as one example, I mean, the Berkeley Sensor Center is one of the earliest and perhaps one of the most successful IUCRCs. That center alone has stimulated formation of more than 30 startup companies coming out of that one center.
Yeah, I'd like a little more to read. I think that's what.
So maybe if I could just add one last item here. I think NSF's interaction with industry is a many splendored thing. So yes, we have IUCRCs, we have STCs, we also have joint solicitations that we do with industry. We collaborate with industry on infrastructure projects, for instance, with cloud providers, for example. So I think we've got a very, very rich history of collaboration in many different vehicles with industry.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on, I really like where you're headed with industry collaboration. I note the term pre-competitive. That will mean something different, as you know, in different fields, because in some fields things are moving so rapidly it's hard to define discretely what that space is. I would also, in that space, I've talked to some industry who said, we will collaborate to foster development of a common standard, because that's an area that, all industries or all companies will benefit from. So there may be some space around emerging standards needs that would be tremendously valuable there.
Ellen? Yeah, I had one comment and one question. On the NSF 2026 ideas stuff, I just wanted to make sure you knew that there's, for federal agencies, a Center of Excellence on Collaborative Innovation. It actually happens to be run by NASA folks at Johnson Space Center. So they've helped a lot of agencies with just, how do you formulate what you're going to put out there? How do you deal with if you do get thousands of things coming in? And so if you haven't already talked to those folks, I'd encourage that. And yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that we've talked with them extensively over the years, and they've been incredibly helpful to us.
Great.
We've learned a lot from them.
Good. And then on the Convergence accelerators, this is just following a little bit along what's already been talked. Given that you're actually producing deliverables, I was just curious if industry has any concern with the non-exclusive IP access, and maybe the workshop that you had on quantum, you already got a little bit of feedback on whether or not, it is still more fundamental research, but the deliverables aspect makes you wonder if that's going to be a little bit of a barrier.
Just a couple of comments. First of all, I agree completely with the statement about pre-competitive. There are some industry sectors where there is no such thing as pre-competitive. It's all competitive, and that is a challenge in some of these partnerships. The workshop that we had on quantum technologies, we had approximately 25 companies that some of which sent multiple representatives to, but they really were excited about the concept of use-inspired basic research, so that there was a problem that was driving it. And that's really what I mean by use-inspired, is that there was a problem driving it, but it was still fundamental basic research that was early in the life of the evolution of the technology, and therefore was, in this sense, pre-competitive. And so they were enthusiastic about the model, enthusiastic about the sharing of the intellectual property, understanding that they would have at some point the right to take it off and become competitive with it, but building on that basic research that was conducted.
Thank you. That was an excellent discussion. I just had a few questions, a few comments rather. I'm assuming industry, I'm very happy to hear that they're engaged and they'll be part of the curation process of these ideas. I'm assuming that will be the case. One of the things, because we do this in the universities at a much smaller scale, increasingly more and more of the universities are doing this, in terms of bringing teams across campus around workshops and curating those ideas and then building the teams, then potentially responding to opportunities with NSF and other agencies. So one of the things that we have to be mindful of is as you create these teams that you have the broad diversity in every possible way, in intellectual diversity or gender diversity or even levels from assistant professors to full professors to geographic diversity, so that as you're building these concepts, it's much more, to the extent that it makes sense. I think it'll be good to have that in mind as you're building these teams and helping them through the process. So this is great. And the last thing I would say, which we do in the university sometimes, is there are winners, of course, but there are not really losers. Some of them may not have good ideas, but some might have had good ideas but might not have reached the level of where you wanted it to be. So I was wondering if there is a way in which you can, with a small amount of money, continue that amount of effort that has been put and keep following up and seeing if they will be ready for the next cycle or something like that, and not to lose those good ideas and start with another fresh slate of ideas. So that may be something.
So yes, we did talk about that if the team is, doing pretty well, but they didn't win the pitch the first time, would we do another pitch 6 months later and they would have some more seed funding? I think these things are all under discussion. But yes, we don't want to totally lose them. But we felt it was important to have that phase 2 prize, like in the I-Corps. The teams that really come out as successful, they can apply for SBIR, and that's kind of the next thing that was really important. We learned from I-Corps, so we thought that was important to have.
Any other comments, questions? Again, thank you so much. An excellent job. I really appreciate that. Thanks a lot. So I think I have the last few minutes for my reflections. So the way I thought I'll do this is, like Jerry said, I had the opportunity of looking at my predecessor yesterday in the event, Chairman Leshner. And I mentioned to him that, what we are doing in terms of, but we still don't have the chair for him as we promised. The top 10 reflections is how I wanted to move forward with this, not to forget David Letterman. I wanted to, in the spirit of thanking, I wanted to start off with thanks and end with thanks and all the things that we have done in between. So first of all, to my committee members, an amazing group of people. It was awesome to work with you all. Thank you, Bob, Carl, Steve, Anila, Emilio, and Bud in the last iteration that we had before we reconstituted the committee, who was in the committee. So as you will see from my report, we have accomplished a lot in the last 2 years, and we'll walk through that very, very quickly. Thanks to every member of the board, because I think what has happened in this cycle is there's a tremendous engagement between the board and the NSF staff, and that has essentially contributed to major progress. You see the outcomes of that even in the previous discussion. To Maria and Diane, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, and I really appreciate it and enjoyed working, doing this. And a special thanks to France and Joan for collaboration with NSF. Since a new world order, we are collaborating even more. So thank you very much for making it possible. I wanted to go, so that is number 10, 9, strategic plan. We had a strong committee and board collaboration with NSF on the development of the 2018-2022 strategic plan, which was published in February 2018. I really appreciate the partnership with Steve Meacham and Susie Iacono on that. Thank you so much for your work. 8, annual budgets. Over the past 2 years, we continue to increase the board's engagement in NSF budget formulation, including more regular and comprehensive updates on budget issues, even in particularly trying budget cycles. So that's, I think, a great progress that we have made. 7, agency reform. The committee and board were also involved in other evolving situations, such as agency reform plan. And we've appreciated NSF's proactive stance in keeping us apprised of changes before going to OMB rather. So thank you so much for doing that. Big ideas, we just heard that. Excellent presentations from the directorates over the last 12 to 18 months. Excellent presentations from the directorates championing the 10 big ideas for future NSF investment, leading to fruitful discussions like what we had today. The board was fantastic, engaging with every one of those big idea presentations during their creation and development. The big ideas are now part of the FY 2018 and 2019 budget and has had favorable reactions from the administration, the Hill, and the scientific communities. I think this is all due to the hard work that all of you have done. Then timely topics. Committee initiated discussion for the record on the important issue of F&A cost reimbursement, as this was a hearing topic in the House Science Committee. 4, partnership discussions. The foundation works with the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and we had presentations to ensure that NSF programs respond to emerging opportunities, and aligning with community concerns and priorities. So I thought that was a great step. And then joint sessions with my colleague, John Anderson, in terms of merit review. It was enjoyable working with you, in those joint sessions. So I hope we'll do more of those into the future. And that takes us to the future. Lots to do in the future, as you can see. That's point number 2. The investments and launch of the 10 big ideas is very exciting, and we look forward to an amazing future. And last, the number 1, again, thanks. I would like to thank the NSB staff, Kathy Jacquard, Elise Lipkowitz, and Executive Secretaries Karen King and Mary Koskinen, Son Jones, Mary Tooney, for all their support during the last 2 years. It would not have been possible without all of your fantastic work. I can tell you the executive secretaries and the staff members make us all look really good. That's all I can say. This concludes the open meeting of the Committee on Strategy. We will move forward in the closed session in a minute once we have cleared the room. Thank you all.
Great. Panch, thanks very much. So let's clear the room so we can go into closed session.